All right, hey everybody, thanks for joining us on this week's episode of the Marriage Puzzle Podcast. I'm here, my name's Thomas, and
I'm Julie.
We are so thrilled that we have Garrett and Chelsea Zimmerman from Transformed Couples, and they are here with us to talk a little bit about their background in this podcast. As you guys know, we are in a little bit of a series on communication. That's what the theme of this month of our podcast has been around. And the Zimmermans, their whole niche is that they are kind of working through a blended family. And so we wanted to kind of figure out your insights about communication from that perspective. And so this week's episode, we talked offline that it's going to be kind of your story. Tell us a little bit about your past, how you got to where you're at. And then we've already decided we're going to have a part 2, you guys.
Yay.
And that's going to be the present. So make sure you guys come back next week and hear more from Garrett and Chelsea. But thank you guys for joining us. Thanks for being on the podcast. And you guys are our first guests for our podcast, so we're excited for that. Thank you for joining us there. But go ahead and I'll let you guys take the floor. You guys tell us a little bit about your story.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. It's super exciting. And we just found out that we're the first guests. This is amazing. And we're thrilled to be here. So thank you both. To start, in terms of our past, we are, as you mentioned, a blended family. And the reason for that is because of previous marriage breakdown and relationships that just didn't work. And it's interesting that we're talking about communication tonight, because communication is a foundational principle in any relationship. And admittedly, as we were talking and kind of preparing for this, it was obvious that communication wasn't healthy in our past. Mm-hmm. And it was the realization of how unhealthy it was, as well as some of the contributing factors to it, that have really shaped us individually, but also as a couple, and have now been a bit of an awareness piece that we've shone a bright light on in our relationship, because we identify the need for it to be strong. So that is kind of where we're at on the communication side. And in terms of, our relationship, we have a blended family of 5. 6 if you include our dog. We got 3 boys. They're 12, 13, and 14. It's busy. There's lots of testosterone. And the whole reason, one of the reasons behind adding a dog to the mix was for a little bit of female energy. So our dog.
Hey, Chelsea, tell me it's a girl.
Oh yeah, she's a beautiful little Morky girl, and we love her so much.
So we are a blended family, and we've been together now coming up on 8 years. And over the period of those 8 years, we've watched our boys grow, and we've watched ourselves grow. Our boys more, literally. When we started, they were much younger, but we've also watched them learn how to communicate, and how they communicate with each other, but also how they communicate with us as bio-parent and step-parent roles. So some really cool dynamics and some real opportunities for them to see the importance of communication, which we're now seeing them as they get older replicate in relationships that they have with friends, but also just being very open to communicate with us about topics, challenges, things going on in their world that maybe they otherwise wouldn't have. So love this topic, love where we're going, and can't wait to jump into it.
Awesome.
That's really cool. I love how you, obviously we're both of our platforms are really kind of based around marriage. I think yours is probably more family oriented than ours even is at this point. I think we're focused a little more on marriage. And I love how you're taking that concept of the relationship between the two of you and the communication between the two of you, and how you're bridging that into your boys and, helping them through the communication issues in their lives and with what they're going through. So I love that. That's really cool. And there's obviously a lot of different dynamics there, as you mentioned, biological parent to step parent and things like that. And as Julie mentioned to you guys offline, we both come from parents who, were divorced and then remarried. And so we've kind of gone through that from the kids' perspective, albeit not from the marriage perspective personally. But so tell us a little bit about, whatever you guys want to go into about your past. Like, how did it get to where you were? I mean, you mentioned that the communication was a big part of the issue and the breakdown of the marriages before. So why don't you elaborate a little bit on that? Of course, we're not out here to put anybody down or anything like that. That's not where we're going with this. But the goal is to try and help anybody else we can in the future, right? And so from hopefully having any of those issues. So and then little teaser alert for next week's episode, we're going to kind of talk about how looking back has helped you in your relationship now. So we want to keep everyone coming back to next week as well. But let's start with some of the past and things that you learned not to do and things like that.
Yeah, so I guess I'll start. Just to clarify, I have never been married.
Okay.
So I was in several fairly serious relationships, one of which was with my children's father. But subsequent to that, I was in a couple of other relationships that did not work out. So I was never in a marriage, whereas Garrett was. So I think for me, one of the things I always love to say is the only time you should look back is to see how far you've come.
Mm-hmm.
And so we loved actually looking back because it really did show us how much of an improvement and how much better we are at communicating now, not only with ourselves, but just with others and our kids as well, as we mentioned. So I think for me, the biggest thing was, and I'll be honest, I was in a fairly abusive relationship. So communication was actually not there at all. I was, and just to clarify, it was not physical abuse, it was emotional abuse. So, if any of the listeners are listening and perhaps you've been through that, or you are currently going through that, the thing when it comes down to communication, and a lot of times, is that you don't always feel like you can. You don't always get to communicate your wants, your needs. But at that point, those things don't matter. So fast forward a little bit, and for me, I really had to I came into the relationship with Garrett, and I had done some work previously on myself just to, heal and, get out of those, negative thought patterns, and really just, but then when I got into relationship with Garrett, it was hard. It was hard to open up. It was hard to trust. It was hard to be vulnerable because obviously I was scared of being hurt. And, when we talk about communication, we talk about, safety, and we talk about vulnerability and the need for those things in order to be able to have great communication. And so it was something that I really had to work on, personally speaking, in terms of just being able to open up. And I'm grateful for the time that I did spend working on myself, because when Garrett and I did meet, I really feel like our communication was good on a surface level, and it just took some time to really kind of dive a little bit deeper into some of those things. So I don't know if you would add anything to that from your side.
Yeah, from my side, and the challenge that I ran into in my past marriage was that when I would communicate or share feelings or thoughts, ideas, they weren't received. So, my ex would turn away, look away, ignore completely, wouldn't even open up to some of the conversations that I wanted to have. And, that rejection piece is really what it boils down to. And as humans, what do we all desire? It's acceptance of self, especially from our partner. And so, when I started to think back on this, I identified, well, that's not something that I want in a future relationship. So it's not that that person turning away is completely making that decision on their own. Maybe there were some things that I needed to do differently in how I communicated. when I communicated, what I communicated, how I said what I was communicating. I mean, there's so many things, and we use the concept of mirroring in that our partners are a mirror for some of the challenge areas maybe that we have inside of ourselves. And so similar to Chelsea, when my marriage broke down and I was sitting there trying to pick up the pieces and make sense of it all, I had to look inside myself first and ask some of those really tough questions, and then identify changes in behaviors, changes in thoughts, changes in words, and how I could approach things differently with my future partner at the time so that we could create a strong relationship in that area of communication because it wasn't strong for me in the past. So, together between both of the work that we did individually, then when we came together, it was so powerful because we had done some inner work, some healing, as Chelsea mentioned, but it didn't make it easy. There's still those mental blocks that for some people are there regardless. And we had to work through them together. But it was so much more refreshing to have a partner who would ask, well, how are you feeling? Why are you feeling that way? What is it that I could do to support you? Simple questions like that can open the door to so much power. And so we started to embrace those conversations. And what was once really uncomfortable for both of us, for different reasons, started to become a real safe space, a place of vulnerability and connection. So it was really powerful. And it's an area now that we continue to work on. Communication is never done.
No.
You've never hit the top of the mountain when it comes to communicating because emotions change and emotions are different day to day and situation to situation. So it's an evolving piece of our relationship and one that we need to hold each other accountable to at times. And it's having that openness to actually be accountable to someone that can create such a strength.
So that's awesome stuff. Tell me a little bit about. I mean, you both said that you kind of looked inward, coming out of those relationships. Tell me about the time frame coming out of that. Were you doing that before the two of you got together, before you met? Was that just a coming out of those relationships? You realized, okay, I've got to do something different before I get myself into something else, or did you guys get into a relationship together and realize, okay, this is totally different. I need to do some work now on myself to make sure it works with each other, or maybe it was both.
Yeah, I would say it's both. I think so. In terms of just a time frame for us, like it's actually kind of crazy. So we met on a bus in November of 2013. And we were headed to a work function. And actually, our communication that day was great because Garrett came up to me and he sat beside me on the bus and we talked the entire way there and the entire way back. Now, after that, there was actually quite a few months that passed that we simply just knew that we worked at the same company together, but we both had to take some time for ourselves because I was fresh out of a relationship and Garrett was just coming out of his marriage. And so we both, and at the time, I didn't even know that Garrett had I didn't know that his marriage had broke down. That was not something that was obviously common knowledge. So it wasn't until May of the following year that we actually we ended up at church on the same day, and it was Mother's Day. And so Garrett came up to me at church and he said, Happy Mother's Day. And that was then that I learned that he was no longer with his wife. And so after that, we kind of got things going more in a forward direction in our relationship. But admittedly, during those months between when we actually first met each other and when we were able to come back together at church, we were both working on ourselves, and we were both very committed to working on ourselves. In terms of myself personally, I was doing a lot of reading, a lot of meditation. I was seeing a counselor. There were different resources that I had sought out because I refused at that point in my life to ever be in a relationship like I was in the past with the people that I had chosen to be with in the past. And so I think that, and then once we did get into relationship again, or not again, but get back, moving the ball forward, we were starting with a very good base of communication, but we realized that obviously as time went by that there was some gaps. There were some things that we needed to work through. And we sought out, friends, and we talked to, family members, and we tried to get some insight and perspective from our community of people, because they wanted to see us together. They wanted us to succeed in our relationship. And, it was just a really, like Garrett said, it's an evolution. So, we evolved during those, first few years. And I mean, if we could go back and probably do it again, we probably would have done a lot of things differently. But again, we learn sometimes by making those mistakes. And, I'll say by the grace of God, we were able to, work through a lot of those issues together and remain together. But it wasn't always sunshine and rainbows.
You mentioned something that stood out to me. You said you met each other on a bus, and you had great communication at that point, and it sparked the thought in me that you both had some communication issues, and at the time what would have likely been one of your top relationships, your number one partner, your partner in life at the time. So tell me about how the contrast between your communication in that relationship versus communication with some of your friends, your family member. How did what was happening in your home impact some of those other relationships? Was it like night and day? Was it like, oh, I can be totally normal with these guys, because they know me? Or was it, kind of spilling over and causing issues in other areas?
Yeah. So a couple of points on that was, as anyone who's gone through divorce knows, there are friends that, will pick a side and will stay closer to the ex-wife versus the ex-husband. And it's such a great question, Thomas, because communication did change in terms of how I would approach certain friends, what I would share with certain friends. And, that was a bit of a filter that I had to apply that I hadn't even had to think about in the past.
Right.
And I did that because I needed to both protect what I was creating in the relationship that Chelsea and I were building, but also I didn't want to put myself in a position where something would be misinterpreted, miscommunicated,
right,
and that could potentially come back and break down what we were trying to build. So, it was learnings that I took away from counseling appointments that I had, as well as just some of the conversations that I had had with certain friends who I could be vulnerable to and share with, and really lean on them for some wisdom and perspective. And I think that's such a great point in terms of communicating. Sometimes we need to be mindful of what we're communicating and who we're communicating it to. And that's something we talk about in our relationship even now, because friends and family can be such an influence on marriages. Some positive, some negative.
Right.
Yeah.
Right? We've all been there, right? That friend who challenges us, or that friend who wants to drag us down because misery loves company. We've been in those situations where we've had to, come forward to each other about advice or thoughts or ideas or things that had been said between friends. And it's like, whoa, like, let's pump the brakes. Let's look at the source. Let's look at what their situation is, what their background is, because as we kind of talked a little bit about offline, relatability is so powerful. And if we're going for relationship advice and we're trying to make sense of some things, but one, we're talking to someone who's single, who's not currently in a relationship or never has been married, like, I'm sorry, but I struggle with really taking your advice as quality advice. Or, talking to people who don't have kids about some of the challenges you're dealing with as parents. Like, a book and a movie isn't going to teach you what it's like to be a parent. I'm sorry, you got to live it.
I wish.
Wouldn't it be nice?
Wouldn't that be nice?
So you're 100% right. You have to be mindful of how you communicate and what you communicate to who. And that was a major learning coming out of a divorce. And I think, now in our relationship, even still, we're constantly being mindful of who we reach out to, who we speak to, what we share, when we share it. Because, yeah, marriage is so sacred and marriage is so special. And sometimes what's happening between a marriage doesn't need to go anywhere else. It needs to be managed within, or it needs to be managed with trusted people that you can really feel comfortable with. So yeah, there's been some work done and some realizations, and it's all part of the evolution.
That's good. I love how much you guys are opening up and sharing your story. I know you don't want to live too much in the past, so we're excited for next week to learn more about those good communication skills that you guys have and what you're doing with transferred couples. But I do have one final question or just topic. Might put you on the spot with this, but just again, the last thing, to like live in the past, obviously, because you do have children with those exes, do you have a piece of advice people who are in that scenario on the topic of communication, how to communicate well from that parenting with your ex and be in this marriage now?
Mm-hmm. So I would say, first of all, just a tiny little bit of background, but I have a very high conflict relationship with my ex, and my kids actually don't see their father as of right now. So, but like you said, we're looking back. And so, when Garrett and I first got together, I was in this high conflict place with my ex, whereas Garrett was actually very proactively co-parenting with his ex.
Okay.
And so there was a huge contrast in terms of my relationship and my communication with my ex versus his communication with his ex. And so I think for us, one of the biggest things that we had to really do was to put boundaries in place. And for us, it was a matter of, there was situations where, there was somebody that was trying to be a bit of a helicopter parent when it came to, times when the kids were with us. And, there were other instances where they felt like they had to call all the time and have a conversation on the phone all the time. And, while those are all great characteristics, to preserve and to make us feel safe in our relationship with each other now, we had to put boundaries in place. And there's no shame in putting boundaries in place. I know that a lot of times, and I'm speaking for Garrett on this, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but sometimes what happens is that you feel like you want to have such a great, because things are so good. It's very rare that you have a great co-parenting relationship with an ex. And so if you do, congratulations, you are very lucky.
Right.
But, when it comes to the ex, I think for Garrett, it was like he wanted to keep the peace with her because he didn't want to have to go through a high conflict, because it was like, things are good, things are okay. But then it was kind of sometimes at the detriment of my feelings and my emotions. And so I had to really communicate to Garrett about, how it was making me feel. The fact that his wife was still, or his ex-wife, sorry, was still referring to them as a family and saying, our family. And it was like, no, like, we are no longer a family. I am no longer responsible to you in that way. I am solely responsible for our son. And when that boundary got put into place, I was then able to, feel more secure. I felt, obviously this person wasn't as much of a threat to me. And I think, obviously from the other side, Garrett was very, when it came to communication with my ex, I was very emotionally driven. So, we would have exchanges of communication where I would just want to like go crazy and like, because there's a lot of mental health issues on the other side. And so I was like, I really just need you to help me to properly kind of take the emotion out of it and communicate better with my ex when it comes to situations involving the kids, because obviously I still wanted to be the bigger person and I wanted to be a good example for my children, and I didn't want to be that person like the other side. So there was times where Garrett was really great at just being like, just give a one word answer. Just keep it simple. You don't have to make it complicated. You don't have to feed into what they're trying to do. You don't have to, you don't have to play that game. And it was like, so there was a really good balance. And I think that, even now in the situation that we're in, like Garrett still has a great co-parenting relationship with his ex, and he has boundaries in place though. And those boundaries are super important because, and communicating those boundaries, was probably not easy for him.
Yeah.
But I think that that's ultimately how it was for us.
That's awesome. We just did a podcast episode last week on burnout, and it's a completely different topic from what we're talking about here. But one of the things that we said in that topic was to invite your spouse in to help them, to help you with a situation. And so I'm going to say this back to you. Yeah, it sounds, Chelsea, like you invited Garrett in to say, hey, can you help me communicate better? And so I think, and you guys may have even, you can correct me if I'm wrong now, but, it would seem like with a blended situation like that, you both are dealing with your own issues with exes. And so you probably don't want to step on each other's toes either, and hurt another family situation. And so I think that invite to your spouse to say, hey, come help me with this. I need your help. We're a family unit now. I need your help here. Sounds like that's kind of what you're alluding to, right? Is the invite to let them know it's okay to come into this area.
Absolutely. And I love that word. I love the word invite, because really at the end of the day, you want your partner to, and it's almost like a permission as well, right? Like, I mean, you're asking them for a perspective, you're asking them for insight, you're asking them to kind of be your voice of reason at times. And so, yeah, I love that term, to just invite them into that. And there's been times where I've been invited back, and it's grown our communication and our relationship and brought it to a new level, because we're able to, like you said, like co-invite each other at times to help one another out with whatever it may be.
That's awesome. It was so valuable. Thank you again for sharing and and going to the past. We're excited to jump to the future next week. But before we wrap up, tell us how people can find you, maybe follow you guys, and what you're doing to help other couples.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're excited for next week. But in the meantime, if anyone's looking, they can find us on Instagram at transformed.couples. If they're on Facebook, we're under Transformed Couples Coaching. And then we're on the World Wide Web at transformedcouples.com.
Awesome. And so just to clarify, it sounds like you guys do coaching for couples, right? So I'm assuming that that's any couple, that doesn't just resonate with blended families, but any couples, right?
That's right. Yeah, we love all couples, and we do specialize in the blended family space because obviously the relatability, but no, we love all couples.
Yeah, and what's really cool about what we do is we do 2-on-2 coaching to provide both a male and a female perspective, but we also within our coaching programs offer 1-on-1. And within that space, we then can take some things away from those 1-on-1 sessions and bring them forward to the 2-on-2. So,
and the 1-on-1, sorry to interrupt, but the 1-on-1 is male with male, female with female,
yep.
Just to clarify.
Yeah, so just some really cool pieces and differences. And also, unlike some coaching programs, we believe in accountability. And so between our sessions with couples, we'll give exercises, homework, and then we check in. It's the first thing we do on the following call, because we believe that there's a lot of knowledge out there, but unless you apply your knowledge, it really just doesn't mean much. So we're big believers in being accountable to each other, being accountable to self, and that's one of the primary deliverables in our process also.
That's great.
Awesome.
Well, thank you guys again for joining us this week. Just to reiterate to everyone who's listening one more time, this week was kind of about the past, and in next week's episode, you guys are going to hear about the present from Garrett and Chelsea, and we're going to talk about some communication tips and things that will help you move forward in your relationship. So maybe they'll be giving a few free advice pieces away from their coaching, so we'll see if we can talk them into that. But thank you guys for joining, and we'll see you guys next week.
Thanks so much. We'll see you.
Thanks for having us.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode of the Marriage Puzzle Podcast. Remember that new episodes release every week on Monday on your favorite place to find podcasts. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at Marriage Puzzle. Remember that blog posts release on the 1st and 15th of every month on our website, marriagepuzzle.com. And if this is your first time listening to us, we hope you'll give us a rating and make sure you subscribe on your favorite podcast channel that you're listening on. And as always, we look forward to having you join us next week, where together we'll work on marriage one puzzle piece at a time.